The Exodus, a pillar of fire, a parting sea, and a nation on the run from the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. But here's the problem. The timeline doesn't add up. According to mainstream Egyptology, there's no evidence, zero, zilch, nada, of any Israelite exodus during the reign of Ramesses II. No plagues, no slaves, no Moses, just construction projects, war records, and peace treaties. But what if we're looking in the wrong century? Let's face it, the traditional timeline has issues. Mainstream scholars place the Exodus around the 13th century BCE, before the Common Era, during the reign of Ramesses II, Ramses the Great, based on the biblical reference to the city of Pi Ramses. Logical? Yes. Correct? Maybe not. Because here's the kicker. In that period, Canaan was controlled by Egypt. There was no mass invasion, no collapse of cities, no break in Egyptian domination. In other words, no Exodus. So either the Bible got it wrong, or we got the timeline wrong. What if we're looking for these events, which the biblical narrative calls historical, in the wrong period? What if Egypt's history is misdated, even by centuries? It's been argued by some that the Egyptian timeline should in fact be shifted down by somewhere between 100 and 300 years. What does that do? It places the Exodus not during the glory days of Ramses, but as far back as the chaos of what's called the Second Intermediate Period, a time of plagues, power struggles, and foreign occupation. And suddenly, the Bible starts making a whole lot more sense. Okay, hold on tight. Here's how redating Egypt's chronology works in under 60 seconds. You see, mainstream Egyptology puts the collapse of the late Bronze Age, and thus the conquest of Canaan, around 1200 BCE. But a revised chronology says wrong. Just look at the synchronisms, the connections between Egyptian and biblical events, and think about how a major realignment might change everything. Now, if we're looking for historical evidence of the Israelites in Egypt and their exodus out of Egypt, what would we expect to find? We'd be looking for a concentration of Semitic people living in one part of Egypt, such as one city in particular. They couldn't possibly be scattered across the length and breadth of Egypt, because the biblical text specifically says that they left together in one night. Do we have such evidence? Well, yes, we do. Archaeology has revealed a settlement known as Avaris. The city of Avaris, located beneath Pi Ramses, shows evidence of a Semitic population explosion, mass graves, and then sudden abandonment. There's a palace, supposedly with 12 tombs, one of which belongs to a high official with what appears to have been a multicolored coat. Sound familiar? This Avaris timeline fits not with Ramses, but with the era of the so-called Hyksos, foreign rulers who took over Egypt during a time of national disintegration. And that's when the theoretical revised chronology places the Exodus. So who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Not Ramses. According to some, we might be looking at Amenhotep II. But we might instead be talking about Dudimos, a pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, whose reign coincided with Egypt's collapse. In the ancient Egyptian Turin king list, Dudimos' rule ends abruptly, with mention of a national disaster. One fragment even reads as follows:
The land was in great affliction. Every man says, I do not know what has happened to me.
Sound familiar? In this period, Egypt was ravaged by plagues, not metaphorical ones, actual records of darkness, famine, water turning into blood, and the death of the firstborn. And shortly after, the Egyptians lose control. The Hyksos, foreign Semitic rulers, sweep in and take over. Coincidence? Or was the collapse of Egypt the direct result of the Exodus? And we have the Ipuwer papyrus, a poetic text generally dated from the end of the Middle Kingdom, long dismissed as poetic hyperbole, but it suddenly sounds eerily familiar.
Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. The slave takes what he finds. Death is everywhere. The land is without light. The children of princes are dashed against the walls. The children of princes are cast out in the streets. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. It is groaning throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. Behold, the fire has mounted up on high. Its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land.
Of course, this isn't proof of the Exodus, but it fits if you're willing to shift the timeline. And what about the parting of the waters as the Hebrew slaves make their way out of the house of bondage? Well, forget Cecil B. DeMille's version in the classic film The Ten Commandments. The Hebrew says the Israelites crossed the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea. Let's consider a different path, east from Avaris into the Bitter Lakes region, a chain of brackish waters and marshes. At Lake Bala or Lake Timsah, strong winds, what scientists call a wind set down, can in fact push water aside even for hours. And when the wind stops, crash. Water floods back in, chariots sink, soldiers vanish. Archaeologist David Rohl calls it a natural miracle enabled by divine timing. Many adventurers chase Mount Sinai to the wilds of Saudi Arabia, Jebel al-Laus, blackened peaks, mysterious carvings. But is there a need for that? Let's stay grounded and consider the traditional Sinai Peninsula route. Northeast to the wilderness of Shur, then south into the Sinai's highlands. This wasn't a sprint to a beach bonfire, it was a mass migration with flocks, children, elders. The path was harsh, mountainous, remote. At the base of Jebel Musa, the traditional Mount Sinai, there's no reason to chase exotic theories. And the silence of archaeology in this rugged wilderness is exactly what we should expect. Nomadic people, after all, leave few traces, but their impact echoes in texts and traditions. So, why hasn't this been accepted by most scholars? Because it demands a serious, even radical reevaluation of the Egyptian timeline. Immanuel Velikovsky, in his 1952 book, Ages in Chaos, proposed a radical redating of ancient Egyptian history. claiming it was out of sync with Israelite history by a good 5 centuries. His central argument revolved around the idea that the Exodus occurred during the collapse of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, rather than the generally accepted New Kingdom period. He interpreted the so-called admonitions of Ipuwer as an eyewitness account of the events surrounding the Exodus, including the plagues and a subsequent invasion by foreign tribes identified as the Hyksos. But Velikovsky's theories faced widespread criticism and rejection from mainstream Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians. Then there's David Rohl, who proposed that the Egyptian dynasties are misaligned by centuries and that events once thought separate are actually the same, seen through a distorted lens. Rohl's new chronology proposes shifting Egyptian history forward by several centuries, arguing that the conventional timeline is off by about 250 to 300 years, especially in the Third Intermediate period. This allows him to match biblical events like the Exodus and the rise of Joseph to archaeological strata not traditionally linked to those stories. But here's the rub. Radiocarbon dating found no evidence to justify the chronological shifts proposed by Rohl. Instead, it appears to confirm the traditional dates for events like the reign of Ramses II, conventionally dated to the 13th century BCE, whom Rohl places much later in the 10th century BCE. Then there's British biblical scholar and Egyptologist John Bimpson, who argues that standard chronology causes problems for a literal reading of the Exodus and conquest. But he prefers a less extreme revision than Rohl's new chronology. He places the Exodus around 1446 BCE, consistent with a biblical literalist interpretation. And he sees the archaeological data as supportive of the Egyptian timeline if it is shifted moderately downward. He argues that the end of the Middle Bronze Age should be redated by over a century, from 1550 BCE to shortly before 1400 BCE. Bottom line, shifting the Egyptian timeline is a Herculean task. But does it hold water? Or in this case, the waters of the Red Sea? If it does, then the Exodus did happen as a historical event. Joseph did rise to power. Moses did lead a people out. And history is not a myth. It's misdated memory. What if the Bible's history hasn't failed archaeology, but archaeology has failed the Bible? This view of the Exodus isn't just a story. It's a call to rethink the very foundations of how we read the past. You may not agree. Most scholars don't. But you won't forget it. Hey, making these videos takes a lot of hard work and research, so don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. And be sure to head over to my website, JewsGodHistory.com, where you can access specially crafted podcasts that take you on a deep dive into Jewish history, thought, and culture. Check it out.